it's because I was saying, I wanted her to sit in the seat, but it's fine. Just let me. Okay, we're ready.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first capacity development event of the 2023 IMF Spring Meetings. My name is Sangeeta Nambi, and I'm from the IMF's Institute for Capacity Development. We have an exciting series of events planned for you this week, so be sure to check out our calendar on IMF Connect. And now, please take your seats, please fill up the empty seats in the back, and silence your cell phones, and the Peek into Training will be about to start.
At the IMF Institute for Capacity Development. And today with my colleague, Marie-Pierre Aquino-Coste, we're going to present to you the Public Debt Dynamics Tool, or DDT, and we are going to discuss how we use the DDT for capacity development, both through technical assistance and training. Let me start by discussing what is the DDT. The DDT is a very simple Excel-based tool that projects the public debt to GDP ratio under a baseline and alternative scenarios. Because of its simplicity, the DDT is being useful for helping countries develop capacity on public debt projections and analysis. So in the previous slide, actually, you can see that throughout the presentation, we do have screenshots of the DDT, and the font in this screenshot may be small. Don't worry about it. The screenshots are only for illustration. But we have shared with you this presentation in the event site. So you can go to the event site using this QR code or the address bit.ly/DDT3. In the event site, you will find this presentation, and you will also find all the files we're going to use today. So the videos, the DDT files used in those videos, and also links to the different courses and tools we are going to be referring to today. So we chose to talk to you today about the DDT, in part because higher debt levels and challenging economic conditions have led to an increase in the risk of debt distress in many countries, and even more so in emerging markets and low-income countries. Projecting the debt-to-GDP ratio for different scenarios is a key step for understanding the risk of debt distress. And as I said before, the DDT can help you with these projections. The DDT is a very simple tool, in part because it only requires data for 10 macro-fiscal variables. And this data is easily available either in your own fiscal file, but also in many published reports. Once you enter this data into the DDT will automatically produce for you public debt projections for different scenarios, and will present to you the key results from these projections in standardized tables and figures. Next, Marie-Pierre will discuss to you why we use the DDT.
Well, as some of you may know, the Debt Sustainability Framework for Low-Income Countries, or LIC-DSF, and the Debt Sustainability Framework and Sovereign Risk for the Sovereign Risk and Debt Sustainability Framework for Market Access Country, or SRDSF, are the two main and official tools for projecting public debt from the IMF. However, the DDT is a very useful tool. It's much simpler and requires much less data. But why is this? This is because the DDT has a much more limited scope. For example, it cannot produce debt sustainability assessment. This is because the DDT projects the debt using the fiscal balance projections instead of issuances and amortizations projections, which are typically much more harder to obtain. Even with a different approach, the DDT is capable of replicating the baseline public debt that we can get from the LIC DSF and the MAC-SR DSF. For this instance, the DDT can be a stepping stone for understanding these very two important IMF tools. Because of its simplicity, the DDT has proven useful for sustainable capacity development. Very busy government officials are able to operate the DDT on their own, even after high staff turnover. Moreover, the DDT is already being used by several countries to improve their debt projections, their policy making, including producing debt reports and improving their communications with the IMF. Now, Leo will present to you how do we use the public debt dynamics tool for capacity development.
The DDT is one of the tools recently developed by the IMF Institute of Capacity Development for its new technical assistant practice on macro frameworks. This practice is focused on macroeconomic forecasting and policy analysis. The objective of this new practice is to help governments improve their policy decision-making and their communication. Because of the DDT simplicity, we have been able to achieve good results with technical assistance very quickly. So for example, we have done only short virtual meetings of, for example, 1 hour per week for a couple of months. And we have also done very short face-to-face missions of 1 week or less. These technical assistance missions often follow DDT training. The DDT is featured in the IMF training program. This can be in workshops focused only on the DDT, but also as part of our standard courses, including the Fiscal Sustainability course. We also have an online course on the DDT, the DDTX, which is available on the platform EDX. This course is now available in English and French, and will soon be available also in Spanish. It takes only 5 to 6 hours to complete the DDTX and learn how to use the DDT. More than 1,000 learners have already worked with the DDTX. In some, we do training on the DDT and, of course, on other topics, virtually, face-to-face, and also on a blended modality in which we combine synchronic and asynchronic deliveries. Now the DDTX videos are also available on YouTube in the IMF Institute Learning channel. We have organized these videos in 3 playlists. The first playlist is about basic concepts for public debt projections. The second playlist is about how you can use the DDT for public debt projections. And the third playlist is about how you can use the DDT for computing possible fiscal consolidation paths to achieve a debt target. In the presentation today, you're going to see 3 of the videos from these playlists. Now Marie-Pierre will present an overview of the DDT.
The DDT projects public debt to GDP ratio following equation 1, in which you can see that debt grows with the real cost of debt, which reflects the interest rate, the effects of the exchange rate on the cost of foreign exchange debt, and the inflation rate. It also grows based on the other flows, which typically can be reflected as the change in financial assets, and decreases with the primary balance and with the real GDP growth rate. To work with the DDT, we need to input data for all the variables in these equations. The DDT also follows some color rules to make your work easier. Information and relevant data should only be entered in yellow shaded cells, which are located in the yellow tabs. Light yellow shaded cells implies that the user can select options from a drop-down menu, while the white cells contain formulas that the users cannot override. To do this, you select the basic information in the basic input section of the DDT input data sheet. On the DDT's input data worksheet, we need to manually input the data needed for projecting public debt with equation 1. Once you input all this data, the DDT automatically produces the baseline scenario, in which you will get as an output not only the projection of your debt to GDP ratio, but also the main debt and macroeconomic indicators implied by these projections. Let's now watch a video describing the main contributors to debt changes in the baseline scenario.
The Ministry of Finance of Macroland asked us to analyze the contributors to the projected increase in the public debt ratio of the country between 2019 and 2025. To that end, we will use our Macroland DDT file, DDT1. We know that the output baseline worksheet presents the baseline debt projections. First, note in the top table that the public debt ratio is projected to increase from 50% of GDP in 2019 to 60.6% of GDP in 2025. This implies a cumulative increase in the debt ratio of 10.6% of GDP. What explains this debt increase? The bottom table and figure in the output baseline worksheet present the contributions to changes in public debt. The last column of the table reports the contributions to the cumulative change in the debt ratio between 2019 and 2025. We can see that the 10.6% of GDP cumulative change of the public debt ratio is the sum of the following individual contributions. The primary deficit contributed to an increase of 5% of GDP. The real interest rate contributed to an increase of 9.4% of GDP. Economic growth contributed to a decline of 14.6% of GDP. That is why it appears with a negative sign in the table. The exchange rate contributed to an increase of 4.4% of GDP. Other identified debt-creating flows contributed to an increase of 6% of GDP. The stock flow adjustment due to intra-year exchange rate fluctuations contributed to an increase of 0.4% of GDP. Thus, the greatest positive contributor to the increase in the public debt ratio of Macroland between 2019 and 2025 is the real interest rate, with a contribution of 9.4% of GDP.
Let's discuss now the alternative scenarios presented in the DDT. You can find these scenarios in the output shocks worksheet of the file. So my clicker, yeah, here it was. Okay. So the first alternative scenario is the historical scenario. In this scenario, the key debt drivers take the average historical value. Thus, comparing this scenario with the baseline scenario help us think about our baseline assumptions and how our baseline assumptions for each key variable is different from the value of these variables in history. So this is a trigger for discussions about the plausibility of our baseline scenario. The DDT also presents a constant primary balance scenario. In this scenario, in every projection year, we use the primary balance of the first projection year. Thus, if we compare this scenario with the baseline scenario, we can illustrate the importance of any fiscal consolidation plan we may have in the baseline scenario. Okay. We also have in the DDT a shocks scenario, one shock scenario for each of the key debt drivers. And if you go to the README worksheet of the DDT, you can choose the size of the shocks for each variable, and you can choose the duration of the shock. The DDT also allows for a fully customized scenario in which the user can change all the assumptions in the baseline scenario. These people have used, for example, to look at the impact on public debt of natural disasters, banking crisis, currency crisis, commodity price shocks, and any other scenario that you think it could have a large impact on public debt. Okay. So we wanted to say that now we are working on a new template that we call the NDDDT, Natural Disasters for the DDT. And what we do in this template, we look at past natural disaster events, and we look at the effects these events had on the key variables that affect debt changes, so on the key assumptions of the DDT. With this template, it's very easy to create natural disaster scenarios for your public debt projections. Sorry, my clicker. Okay, here. The DDT also produces debt fund charts. In the next video, you're going to see how we can interpret these debt fund charts in the DDT.
The Ministry of Finance of Macroland asked us to present a probabilistic analysis of the projected evolution of the public debt ratio in the country. We can prepare this analysis using our DDT file, DDT1 adjustments. We will base our analysis on the results produced in the fund chart worksheet. We can see that the symmetric fund chart is not centered around the baseline scenario in the black line. This happens because we have not yet generated the fund chart using Macroland's data. To generate the fund chart with Macroland's data, we must simply click the blue button in this worksheet. Now, we see that the symmetric fund chart is centered around the baseline scenario. For reporting back to the ministry, we will assume a symmetric distribution of shocks, and thus focus on the symmetric fund chart. We will also assume that all shocks are activated. To confirm this, all shocks must be on. Using the percentiles of the distribution of debt trajectories generated in the fund chart worksheet to approximate probabilities, we can report to the ministry that, as shown at the bottom of the blue table in the output baseline worksheet, the probability of the 2030 debt ratio being lower than the 2019 ratio is over 70%. The probability of the 2030 debt ratio being below the 40% ceiling in its fiscal rule is less than 35%. Note that these numbers are approximated with the fund chart and may change slightly if we click the blue button again, generating a new distribution of the debt trajectories. Looking at the 2030 debt level in the 90th percentile in cell A035 in the fund chart worksheet, we can also report that there is a 90% probability of Macroland's public debt ratio being below 58% in 2030.
The DDT also calculates different fiscal consolidation scenarios. These are particularly useful, for example, if you want to see what specific policies would help you achieve a specific defined debt to GDP target, debt to GDP ratio, which is, for example, related to fiscal rules. Under the adjustment paths input, you need to specify which is the public debt to GDP target which you would want to test. In there, you also need to incorporate when your adjustment path starts and ends. Moreover, you can also incorporate second round effects to your projections into the additions to baseline assumptions for fiscal adjustment paths. Based on these inputs, the DDT computes automatically different fiscal adjustment paths, telling you which is, for example, the level and the yearly change of primary balance that yields that specific target you have specified in the year you have as an end of your adjustment period. Let's now watch a video describing one of the fiscal adjustment scenarios.
The Ministry of Finance of Macroland asked us to compute the constant primary balance it will need to implement between 2025 and 2030 in order to bring its public debt ratio to 40% in 2030, as required by Macroland's fiscal rule. The Ministry gives us the file DDT1 with its baseline debt projections. We will work with this file, but first, to have a record of our calculations, we will save it under the name DDT1 Adjustments. To enter the assumptions requested by the Ministry, first in the README worksheet under Adjustment Path Inputs, we enter the requested debt target of 40% to be achieved with a fiscal adjustment that starts in 2025 and ends in 2030. We build the scenario assuming that key debt drivers take the baseline values. To do so, we choose time-varying values under values of key variables for adjustment path. And we make sure we don't input anything under addition to baseline assumptions. With that, we are done inputting our assumptions for the fiscal adjustment scenario. We can find the level of the primary balance that yields a 40% debt ratio in 2030 in the blue table of the output baseline worksheet. Then, we can report to the Ministry of Finance of Macroland that under the assumptions in the baseline scenario, maintaining a primary balance of 1.9% between 2025 and 2030 will imply a debt ratio of 40% in 2030. Let's now look at the worksheet Debt Target Constant Primary Balance. First, we can confirm that this is achieved with a primary balance of 1.89% between 2025 and 2030. We can also confirm that the debt target of 40% for 2030 is achieved under this adjustment scenario.
So to conclude, let me say that the DDT is tailored for do-it-yourself capacity development. Its simplicity allows for the sustainable transmission of knowledge to a variety of counterparts. Many countries are already using the DDT, including for creating public debt reports. So in a minute, we're going to open the floor for questions. If you have any questions, please ask for the microphone, or if some of you maybe have worked with the DDT and want to share your experience, you have here also our email address in case you have questions later on. Before concluding, let me emphasize that the videos you have seen are part of a large and growing effort by the IMF to provide online learning, and that this effort is made possible by the financial support of the government of Japan. Thank you. Question over there.
Thank you.
My name is Telmo Vargas. I'm from Costa Rica. I was Minister of Finance 22 years ago. I find these tools very important. And let me talk about the primary balance. The primary balance could be achieved by increasing taxes, by reducing expenditure, and you have different effects depending which path you choose. The other possibility would be to use the G, the growth rate of the economy, to accelerate the growth. It is much better to reduce the debt by increasing the velocity of growth of the economy, because you reduce unemployment, you reduce poverty, and even increase the taxes that go to the government. My question is, if you have this kind of, could this type of analysis be made with your model?
Thank you. No, thank you. That's a great question, and I think will allow me to emphasize now. I like to describe the DDT as a calculator. So there is no judgment or opinions in the DDT. These are all accounting identities. And basically the equation Marie-Pierre presented to you. And this equation, you can see, as you were emphasizing, that debt is driven by both the primary balance and growth. And if you have a debt target, you could achieve the debt target by changing any of these two, your assumption or on any of these two variables. And the DDT is only doing the calculations for you as a calculator, but it's not telling you which option will be better or not. What we try to emphasize, and when we work with government authorities with the DDT, is that the DDT is so easy to use that it's very easy to create different scenarios. So very easily, you can look at a scenario as the one you were suggesting, in which higher growth will allow you to lower the debt level. So the way, again, I think this calculator is useful is that it allows you to look at many scenarios very easily, and then you can confront the alternatives you have in mind. Thank you. Over here, please.
Good afternoon. So my name is Nicholas Damasi. I'm with American University here in DC. So my question for you, are we getting feedback, or is it, can you all hear me? Okay. My question is, how well can your model handle the potential for missing data? Because sometimes it can be difficult to collect accurate data. Thank you.
So I can possibly tell you, for example, you're asking how can these handle missing data? The fact is that for the DDT to work, you need to input not only historical data, but also your projections or assumptions on how the projection horizon will look. However, the DDT can produce forecasts, even if projections, if you only have 1 year of historical data. But you lose the capacity of analyzing how your projections compare to the historical scenarios. In another form that you can have missing data is that, for example, you may have missing forecast or projections or assumptions for the forecasting horizon, right? So in that case, you can either make assumptions or shorten your forecasting horizon. But as Leo mentioned, it is literally a calculator, so it needs all the input to be given. But what it allows you to do is, for example, if you don't know whether your primary balance will be minus 1.2 or 1.0, you can try with both options. Or if you are discussing different policies with your authorities, you can present to them the different alternatives you have to, for example, achieve a certain fiscal rule. So it's literally a calculator. You need to input the data for it to produce its forecast. However, you can play with assumptions or different options that the authorities are analyzing for certain policies.
Let me add maybe one thing that in our experience working with governments, one of the functions of the DDT that people have found more appealing is that when you look at historical data, if there are inconsistencies between your flows, like the primary balance, and your data for the stock of debt, this inconsistency will show in the DDT. So the DDT can help you identify these inconsistencies are either in data or in accounting practice. So that's a very useful first step for understanding these inconsistencies and also for thinking how you will account for this inconsistency in your projections. Thank you.
I can maybe add one more thing to that, and it is that we mentioned earlier the LIG DSF and the SR-DSF, which is the sovereign risk for market access countries, and the debt sustainability framework for low-income countries. Those tools, which are the official IMF tools for these tasks and for debt sustainability analysis, use below-the-line fiscal projections for their forecast, while the DDT uses mostly above the line because it relies heavily on the primary balance. So that's what Leo is mentioning there, that by looking at the discrepancies that you get, which is contained in the residual, you also understand the issues you have collecting data or even reporting data between your above-the-line accounts and your below-the-line accounts, and it's very useful. And what we typically do when working with authorities is that we pay a lot of attention to this residual because it also allows you to explain whether your projection for the projection horizon makes sense or not. Because if you have been accumulating very large residuals, you should also be taking those into account for the future.
Hello, my name is Aziz Al-Usaimi. I'm from Ministry of Finance, Kuwait. My question is that, first, thank you for the informative presentation. My question is that how is this DDT can be, the model can be integrated into the macroeconomic model, like financial programming or something like that?
Into a what, sorry, can you repeat?
How it can be integrated into the financial programming macroeconomic model or DSGE or something like that?
That's a very great question. In fact, the participant is asking how can we incorporate the DDT to our macro frameworks or FPPs or whatever kind of macroeconomic framework you're using for your forecasting. We have been actually working with this on several countries, and you can link directly the DDT to your macro framework by producing the DDT input data directly from your macro framework or your macroeconomic projection tool. And if you're, for example, using the SR-DSF or the LIG-DSF, we are working on manuals to show the countries how to link this to the DDT, and also how to incorporate these to your macro frameworks. For example, you first produce your forecast, your projections, for everything but your debt with your macro framework. All these inputs are going to feed your DDT directly. And then what you're going to verify is whether your forecast for debt reflects what you are forecasting also on your macro framework. But it's also very important to incorporate within your macro framework the debt dynamics equation. So both your macro framework and the DDT are following the same methodology. But if you are either using this debt dynamics equation or the one in the LIG-DSF or MAC-SR-DSF, you're going to get the same result if you are doing the link correctly.
So the link would be one direction or like a dynamic direction? So it would be like taking...
What we typically recommend, Leo can possibly tell more, but what we typically recommend is doing it one direction because the DDT also allows you to shock certain variables. So if you were to generate feedback from the DDT to your macro framework, you would have certain circularities and endogeneities that you will need to solve also. So it's better to produce your baseline scenario with your macroeconomic baseline scenario or your macro framework on your macro tool, input this input data into the DDT, and then shock this baseline to see how it would react to different shocks and different conditions of the economy. I don't know if Leo wants to add anything else.
No, thank you. It's a great question. And as we said before, the technical assistant practice of our department is exactly on macro frameworks. Yeah. And the DDT is like a satellite tool of your macro framework. Sometimes we do TA and training only on the DDT, but very often the DDT TA is part of our DDT in macro framework. Now, it's typically the case that your macro framework already has some depth projection equation. What has happened, so in the DDT, we're very careful about the accounting. So what has happened is that we have found using the DDT inconsistencies in the depth projections of the macro framework that we can fix to have consistency with the DDT, which we check is the correct one. Thank you. Thank you. Any other question or comment? No, if not, I think we can wrap up. I don't know, Sangeeta, if you're, yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you to our presenters for this Peek Into Training, and thank you to our IMF partners more broadly for their support to our capacity development. If you come up with any other questions, the presenters will be available down the hall in the CD experience in the atrium. And finally, I would like to remind you that we have a CD talk planned for Wednesday at 11 a.m. in this room on climate change and green growth. We hope to see you there. Thank you.
Thank you.